We'll go ahead and give the 1-minute warning. If everybody wants to go ahead and take a seat, we'll get started in about 1 minute. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good evening and welcome to the Frazier History Museum. I'm Rachel Platt, the Director of Community Engagement here at the Frazier. And tonight we are kicking off a 4-part conversation series entitled Racial Reckoning. The series on racial justice will focus on housing tonight. Then on subsequent evenings in October, November, and December, we're going to take up the topics of education, policing, and health. And the Ollie Center will host the next discussion on education on October the 28th, just to let everybody know. The Frazier thanks Fifth Third Bank for its sponsorship for our portion of this programming. The Frazier, we want to let you know, partnered with the Courier Journal and the Muhammad Ali Center for these important programs intended to break down the causes of social injustices and to look for creative solutions to amend them. On the front row here, I'd like to give a shout out to the Muhammad Ali Center, Ashley Hazley and Jeannie Conkey, and with the Courier Journal, Vita Morgan and Mary Irby Jones. So thank you all so much for your partnership. The CJ, as you know, has been addressing these issues in depth with their Beyond Brianna series and other ongoing stories that they continue to do. These issues have always been key to the Muhammad Ali Center and the focus of its current exhibit, in case you haven't been, and that is Truth Be Told, the policies that impacted Black lives. The Frazier just recently opened our exhibit, West of 9th, Race, Reckoning, and Reconciliation. If you didn't have a chance to see it tonight, if you don't mind coming back another day, we'd love to have you. We thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This is a really good crowd in person, and we know virtually as well. We hope that we can help bridge those divides of injustice, helping to shape a better future for everyone as we learn more about our history and why Louisville is so segregated. And if you think it's by accident, you're going to learn a lot tonight. With that said, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening, Trent Finley, the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at Metro United Way. So I'm going to hand off the mic to him.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for having me. And no, not by accident, but by design. In order to understand what we're experiencing on the heels of the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and others, tonight we're going to take a look at some systems that are in place that can explain some of those things, and many others. Tonight we're going to focus on housing, and we'll talk about those policies and some of the work that Metro United Way is doing to address the racial wealth gaps in just a moment. But first, we want to let you know that tonight we will begin with 2 storytellers who bring unique perspectives to the table, and as do our panelists who will join us in just a few minutes. Our panelists include Ja'Cory Arthur, Metro Council, District 4, Jackie Floyd, a resident of Russell and the lead community outreach specialist for Russell, a place of promise. John Borders, a real estate attorney and a member of the board with Louisville's Urban League. Celine Moutier Maria, a community organizer and housing justice advocate. Before I introduce our esteemed storytellers, a few statistics for you. And some of these came from the Courier Journal's special report, Breonna Taylor. Today in Louisville, 36% of black households own their own home, while 70% of white households do. And just 2.4% of the city's businesses are black-owned. In 1969, the median income for a black family in Louisville was 64.6%. 64.6% of the overall median family income. Today, that figure for Jefferson County is 66.9. It's barely changed in 50 years. We're going to talk more about how we got here with our panelists and specific policies in place through the years that set us on this trajectory. But first, we want real-life stories, witnesses to policies that impacted them directly, and how they're still dealing with some of the trauma in fighting those policies even today. We have Ed White, who founded the River City Drum Corps, along with his wife, building bridges through music. He's also on the board of the Portland Museum, as the museum looks to obtain the carousel from the old Fontaine Ferry amusement park that was whites only until 1964, when blacks were finally allowed in. But we begin with Maddie Jones, a longtime civil rights and social justice activist, participating in countless causes, marches, and demonstrations. She was the 2020 recipient of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Award and was in Memphis preparing for a demonstration when Dr. King was assassinated. She was born in Tennessee and moved to Louisville as a child and learned the harsh realities of racism when she applied for a clerk's position at U of L and was told white women in the office wouldn't work with her. Here to tell her story, we welcome Maddie Jones.
Good evening, my brothers and sisters. Let's take a little trip down memory lane for me. In the year of 1991, I had just finished Central High School. My mother and my father had the opportunity to purchase a home, 1002 South 28th Street. We were the only black family in that block from Market Street all the way over across Doomsday. We were very happy and was enjoying this nice home until we walked out on the porch in the mornings, and my mother, Southern born, was used to saying good morning and hello to everybody, but that was no response from our neighbors. They were all white. We were the only black on that block, and they would not speak to us. So we saw signs coming up in the yards for sale. We saw big moving trucks moving people out. And it didn't faze me at that time, being 18, that they were running from us, that my family was known as a blockbuster. The white realtors had called us blockbusters when we moved into a white neighborhood, and we were black. So one morning, my mother decided she needed a few items for breakfast to go to the grocery. So we went up to the grocery store. I think at that time it was Gatton's Market, right in the middle of 28th Street. And we went in, and everybody looked at us like, we were something strange. And no one said anything. My mother stood there. No one said, may I help you? So after a few minutes, my mother decided we'd walk out the store. And my mother slammed the door when we walked out. Headed home on 28th Street, I began to realize that something was wrong. And I said to my mother, she was angry, and I was angry too, to the point that I was almost ready to start crying. And I said to my mother, I said, what is wrong? She says, well, we're not wanted. So that put my mother in the position, in order to buy groceries, she would have to drive all the way from 28th in Kentucky to what they called the Haymarket then, that was on Preston Street, from Preston and Floyd and Brook, all up in that area on Jefferson Street, was what they called the Haymarket. and that's where she was able to purchase her groceries. So she would ride every morning, every once a week, she would ride to that particular market to get our groceries and mark back. Well, we noticed too that as we gradually began to learn that other African Americans were moving into neighborhoods, the Klan was burning crosses, people's homes were being bricked, but none of that did not happen at 1002 South 28th Street. All the people did was had a total silence and had nothing to do with us whatsoever. But my mother and my father stood the task, and we stayed in that home at 1002 South 28th Street. And then the marching in Alabama began, and Georgia began to come forth, and I began to wonder, and it opened up my eyes and my mind to things that was going on. So eventually, I began to look around in the neighborhoods and see such big changes. And I wondered too, what good was going to come from this? So after that, we began to stand up and say, listen, this is not right. We should be able to purchase a home anywhere that we want to purchase this home. So I joined the movement for open housing and public accommodation. And at that time, I had made up in my mind that I was kind of fed up with this situation that was going on just because of the color of my skin, my paint job. I could not live comfortable in a neighborhood. So after marching, going to jail many times, and standing up, one thing that is very vivid in my mind is when the aldermen at that time began to deal with passing the resolution for open housing and public accommodation. And I remember very well, one of the councilwomen, Louise Reynolds, she stood on the floor and said that her vote was not going to count, but she wanted to be documented that she was for open housing and for public accommodation, the only alderperson that we had that voted for this issue. But we finally got to that mark. We got the open housing and the public accommodation, and we were able to hopefully move into neighborhoods and be comfortable. So after all of that's going through, I began to wonder in my mind, is the battle really over? And I have a daughter here very recently. She decided that she was going to move out a little bit, not too far out, but she seen a home that she liked, and she made a contract for it, and the real estate agent said yes. He checked out everything, her job, everything was okay and fine. And she really thought that she was going to be the buyer of this home. Several days later, the agent called, and he said to my daughter that he made a mistake, that the property was not going to be ready in time for her to move in. He could not get the renovation finished. So my daughter accepted that, and I did not. I said, look, I don't believe that. I said, why don't you let me send a couple of my white buddies and apply for this house and see what they have to say to them. But no, she said no, said that's all right. And then too, my mind began to wander back and say, listen, this battle is not won. Regardless of the law of open housing and public accommodation, they have gotten more sophisticated and more dignified in thought in what they were doing. And we have not won this battle. Do we really have truly our choice of where we want to live and be comfortable? Those questions remain in my mind each and every day that I have to walk the streets. No, the battle is not over. We made a few little gains, and we have not finished the task. And that task will not be finished until we as people, whatever color we may be, whatever language we may speak, the battle is not won until we have total, equal, equality, justice, and freedom for all of us, and peace to all of us as we walk this earth and stay on this good planet. I thank you.
Thank you, Maddie Jones. And now we have Ed White, again, the founder of the River City Drum Corps and on the board with the Portland Museum. And as the museum tries to acquire that carousel that so many children rode at Fontaine Ferry, Ed was one of the children who wasn't able because of the color of his skin, even though it was on 64 acres in West Louisville. He was on the outside looking in. Here is Ed White with his story.
Good evening. You know, when I was asked to do this, I thought it would be enjoyable, but it's not. And the reason it's not enjoyable because it made me have to relive a lot of things that I had forgotten. And the closer I got here, the more things just kept coming. And it almost was to the point that I really didn't want to do it. And the reason why I didn't want to do it, because what's going to change? You know, we sit here and go through these conversations and everybody gets all hyped up and psyched up and fired up. And after we leave here, what's going to happen? You know, as I come down Jefferson Street, look at Jefferson Park now. What was it like a year ago? Look at it now. It's all pristine and pretty. You know, everybody said we're going to do this and everybody said we're going to do that, but what did we do? We still back to point zero. Everybody's done forgot about it. Everybody's gone back to their own little comfort zone and everything's all right. So what are we going to do? So for me, growing up in Portland, does anybody know where Portland is? Have you heard the stories of Portland? Believe me, they are true. But for me, they are true. What you heard is true. Because Portland in the 1950s and 60s was a racially charged atmosphere. Portland had a policy of no niggers north of Market, past 15th Street to 34th Street. And that was the truth. Fortunately for me, guess where I was at? I was north of Market Street. And so life for me was a life of boundaries. There was places I knew I could go and places that I knew I better not be caught. Because if it was nigger. And if you didn't leave in a hurry, you would get some physical damage done to you. There were 3 spots. There was a whole bunch of them, but I'm going to give you just these 3. I could go on and on and on, but I'm just going to give you 3. There was a place called Boone's Park. Boone's Park was in East Portland. And the white boys past 21st Street didn't mess with the white boys in East Portland because the white boys in East Portland were extremely impoverished, very uneducated, lack of employment, and they was rough as nails. So one day, my daddy told my big brother, said, boy, weed at 6 o'clock. I'm gonna give you this money and you go in the bread store and get some bread. That meant he had to go past Boone's Park. I said, oh Lord. You know, and he's my big brother, so he always recruits me into his stuff. So he recruited me and said, man, we gotta go get the bread. I said, oh no. So I said, I tell you what, let's do. Let's take the dogs with us. So we had 2 dogs, Groucho and Skippy. So we going up to get to Boone's Park. White boys already sent out the telegram that we're on the way. So we meet a group of white boys right at Boone's Park, and they say, you know, niggas, when you come back, we're going to take your bread, kick in your ass, and kill your dogs. So we had a choice, either go get the bread or face our daddy, because our daddy said we eat at 6 o'clock, and we better have some bread. So off we go through the white boys, get the bread, and he looks at me and I look at him as we approach the entrance to Boone's Park. Oh, Lord. They come out, they get us around us. The dogs created a distraction because we let them go, and off we ran. Dogs came behind us. We got home, 6 o'clock, ate bread, had a good dinner, didn't have to face our daddy. So, and you know, that's just the way it was. And we had to do that all the time. And then there was another park called Portland Park. Portland Park had these little wading pools in them. By then I was a teenager, and we were a little, you know, we was feeling ourselves a little bit. So on Sundays, what we would do is, to have fun, we would go and get in the pool, knowing that we were not going to be in the pool long, because it was always the adults. And so about that time, there was a men's athletic club right across the street. So the word got over to them that these niggas in the pool. About that time, here they come, and you know, we played for a little bit. Nigga. So by then, we'd get off and run. But fortunately, it was a dangerous thing, but we had fun because we knew we would never get caught. So once we turned 27 to Lytle, we knew we were safe because that was our boundaries. And we didn't allow white boys on our street. So, you know, that's the way it was. And then the third place, that since I'm on the board, they want to bring back the carousel for Fountain Ferry, which is really Fontaine, but we called it Fountain. We just left that out. So as we would go to Chickasaw Park, and then this is another crazy thing. To get to Chickasaw Park meant that we had to go through the white, affluent community of West Louisville. Because before, as Miss Maddie said, and Miss Maddie fought for the open housing, all of the fluent people, lawyers, doctors, or whoever was somebody lived in the West End. In fact, my brother bought a house that was built by a doctor. Okay, so meant we had to, you know, you're riding down and you get to Southwestern Parkway and Market. There was 64 acres of pure fun. When you get to the park, when you get to Southwestern Parkway and Market, you see this big Olympic-sized swimming pool. You see the diving board. Once you make the turn, then you see the roller coaster. You hear the sounds of the carousel. The Dirty Devil's on the corner. You see people, you know, getting ice cream. And I asked my daddy, I said, well, why can't we stop? He said, they don't allow colored people. Back in them days, you didn't ask too many questions. If that's what they said, that's what they said. So we had to ride past Fountain Ferry, go down Southwestern, go on the outskirts of Shawnee Park, because she wasn't allowed to go in Shawnee Park. So then we go down, hit Broadway, hit Southwestern Parkway again, and you saw these fabulous houses that even if you had the money, they wouldn't sell it to you. And if they did sell it to you, they'd probably find a way to burn it down and get you out. So now once we got into Chickasaw Park, it was fun because it was just us. You got the tennis courts is always full, basketball courts full, one of them little wading pools full, swings full. Seesaws full, it was a grand time. But guess what? He had to be out before it got dark. Because once it got dark, that affluent community was a sundowner town. You know what sundowner means, don't you? It means all niggas got to be out before it gets dark. If you don't, you're going to either have to deal with some white boys or some crazy police. Out. Get home. Hurry up and get home. Hurry up and get out of here. So now I'm on the board of directors of the Portland Museum. And somehow they found out that the carousel that was in Fountain Ferry Park is in storage somewhere. So they have this grand idea that they're going to bring this thing back. For what? You know, so we can live again, you know, make America great again. So after a board meeting's over that day, we coming out and we sitting out talking, and this guy comes across the street. He lives right across the street from the Portland Museum. And he is so happy. He is elated that we have first found the carousel, and that second that we have plans to bring it back. So he comes up, starts talking and about happy he is and how his boys and how they had a good time in Fountain Ferry, and Fountain Ferry was the place to be. And then he looks at me and asks me, what about your stories from Fountain Ferry? Were you excited about going to Fountain Ferry? Yes, he did. He looked me straight in the eye and asked me that question. I looked at him, and I had to be politically correct when I wanted to tear his head off, you know, but I had to be politically correct, and we have to do that all the time. We always have to stay politically correct no matter what craziness is going on around you. I looked at him and I said, man, you know they didn't let black people in Fountain Ferry. It was like a deer in headlights. And we was still in a conversation, and then he said, oh man, I'm sorry. I said, don't be sorry. It is what it is. What's sorry gonna do for us? And so we sat there and, you know, so the boundaries, a life of boundaries, are excited. How can we be excited? What are we gonna do? Because when we leave here tonight, what are you all gonna do? Because change, if you want to see change, change begins with the man and the woman in the mirror. I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much to both Ed and Maddie. And they're going to stick with us as we begin our conversation with our panelists. But first, I'm going to touch on some of the policies that impacted Ed and Maddie, some that were in place even before them. I spoke about some of the work that we do at Metro United Way. One of the things that we present here in the community is a racial wealth gap simulation, where we explore 13 historic federal policies that paved the way for some of the societal norms that we see today. And so if you look at the screen here, we go through in chronological order 13 historic policies that start with Andrew Johnson's land policies and sharecropping. We all have heard the terms redlining, housing contracts, and the like, but a lot of times we don't know that they are tied to actual federal policies. So if you see here, after the Civil War, only 30,000 African Americans owned small plots of land compared to 4 million who did not because of the 1865 federal law that rescinded the government's promise of 40 acres of land for former slaves. These 4 million black people largely resorted to renting the farmland of their previous master in exchange for a share of the crop. This system of sharecropping tied farmers to their former masters because they were legally obligated to buy all farming materials, usually at higher prices, and sell their farming crops solely to their former master, usually at lower prices. And you can see there the result and the effect that it's had. We can see the effect that it's had on our city even today, as you can in cities across America. And I'll point out that one thing that most people don't know, we understand the concept of sharecropping, but we're not told that 80% of sharecroppers made no profit. It was essentially forced labor. There were 3 forms of forced labor, and the last of those, convict leasing, didn't end until technically the 1940s. Next, we have land seizures. That's 1865 until present day. From 1865 on, black people could have their land seized to pay sharecropping debts, or simply because white landowners declared that black farmers or businesses were in debt. Black people could not fight these charges because they were legally prohibited from suing white people in court. In addition, from 1949 to 1970, 1 million people lost their land to the abuses of the power of eminent domain, which allows local governments to seize private property. About 70% of these families were African American. And you can see the result of that actual policy, and again, we see the lasting effects today. The last policy that I'll look at tonight is the National Housing Act of 1934, and this is broken up into 2 parts because one, we can attribute to redlining, and then the other we can attribute housing contracts. Policies under this law guaranteed federally backed loans to white people and legally refused loans to black people and anyone else who chose to live in or near black neighborhoods. We heard both Ed and Maddie speak about this. This practice, known as redlining, targeted entire black neighborhoods and identified them as grade D. This made it nearly impossible for appraisers in the private sector to do business in black neighborhoods because all the residents were considered bad credit risks. One of the things when we go through this simulation that I try to highlight is that a lot of these policies are not on the outside. They don't seem to be race neutral, but it's all about how they're administered. National Housing Act of 1934, Part 2, housing contracts. So since this legislation prevented black people from receiving federally backed home mortgages, white people usually purchased homes in black neighborhoods and then sold housing contracts to black people who wanted to become homeowners, often for 2 or 3 times the amount of the mortgage. These contracts only guaranteed black families the rights to the house after all payments were complete. Missing even one payment or being late would result in the black family losing their house immediately. So we know that housing contracts are something that stripped additional income and wealth from several generations. And again, we see the effects of that today. All right, John Borders, you wrote an op-ed about this in the Courier Journal and studying those policies. And say everyone needs to understand the history of them. Why? And when did you become aware?
I became aware at an embarrassingly late age in life. I have practiced law for 30 years, but not just law, real estate law for 30 years. So you would think that I would have known something about redlining other than just knowing about it as a term in history. And then I read Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. Hopefully many of you have read it. If not, I highly recommend it. It will shake you to your core when you recognize that the government, and that's local, state, and federal, all branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, all engaged in purposeful, systematic discrimination and thievery of black wealth in this country. As a citizen, learning about that, it turned me from a sympathizer to someone who wants to be an anti-racist activist. Because I am complicit as a citizen in a country that has robbed wealth from a good percentage of its citizens. There are a couple of things that I'll add, a couple of programs that I'll add that, again, I'm embarrassed that I didn't know about sooner. So I've closed loans hundreds, if not thousands, of FHA and VA loans with my family law practice, had no idea that FHA and the VA didn't permit, required deed restrictions that prohibited black families from living in white neighborhoods. This created the middle class in America, which is almost exclusively white. Other policies, the GI Bill, intended to help veterans when they returned from war with housing and with education, except the government once again chose to give nearly all of the benefits to the white veterans that had returned rather than the black veterans. I can't imagine sharing a bunker, literally working to save the life of somebody who you're fighting with against the enemy abroad, only to come back to the United States and to once again be treated as a second-class citizen, or that's actually generous. The 1949 Housing Act also created segregated housing, oftentimes turning integrated neighborhoods into segregated neighborhoods, creating urban slums and ghettos that still exist today. Locally, and at the state level and at the federal level, zoning laws prohibited blacks from living in white neighborhoods. We saw that with Carl Braden and Ann Braden as they attempted to, they had the chutzpah to move a black family into a white neighborhood. And what happened? Firebombing of the house. Who got arrested? The Bradens got arrested, not the person who did the firebombing, right here in Louisville, Kentucky. And if you think it's ancient, let's look back to 2008 and 2009, the housing crisis. What happened there? A good number of the people who lost their homes were victims of what's known as reverse redlining. Reverse redlining is where lenders would go to borrowers, mostly black and people of color, and they would sell them bad loans. And so the word that I heard at the time on the street was these were borrowers that were high risk. These were borrowers who were a bad risk for the lenders, so they earned bad terms on their loans. The reality is that's not the case. Most of these borrowers had good credit and could have had a better loan. So with that housing crisis, among the first people to lose their homes were those that had been victims of reverse redlining, where they owed literally more on the mortgage than the house was worth. Couldn't literally get it back. And the other thing that I'll mention that I don't think has been mentioned tonight that has a huge impact on wealth disparities in the country today is the school-to-prison pipeline that we have with mass incarceration. And Democrats have as much complicity, if not more, than the Republican Party in making sure that that has happened. Decent housing creates a safe environment for people to live in, but it also creates opportunities for wealth building. And wealth building is critical for getting out of poverty. And wealth building is what our government engaged in robbing black citizens of. So it is something that all of us are complicit in. I'm a little sheepish to participate in a forum like this because I'm not an expert on race. I don't think about my race. I won't think about it when I leave here. I didn't think about it when I taught my kids how to drive and how to respond if they got pulled over. I'm not an expert on race, but I am trying to be an informed citizen on the history, because I think that education is so important. You know, you can't have understanding without first having education. And understanding, I think, leads to compassion. And then compassion can lead to action. But you can't start with asking people to engage in action. You have to start at the beginning, and you have to start with education. So I'm pleased to be part of this, and very grateful for the organizations that are helping to educate all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Other panelists, feel free to weigh in on that question as well, including Ed and Maddie. You all can speak when you want to. What other policies are we missing from the past with a big impact still today?
I'd love to add on to what John shared. And for me, getting into this work, housing advocacy and organizing in the community and things like that, I started to realize that we live in a society that focuses so much attention on individual choices and less attention on the systems that are in place which limit people's abilities to choose different options for themselves. When I got serious about my organizing and activism work in 2019, I went to a presentation in the community, and one of my favorite local researchers, Asia Barber, shared a quote that I live by to this day, which is that the choices people make are based off of the choices people have. And yet for some reason, I feel like we live in a world where individual choices, we are obsessed with criticizing and criminalizing individual choices, and yet we're not paying attention to the systems that people live in, which determine which choices they even have to make. We don't look at systems and question, is this system working? Does this system need to be reworked? Does it need to be dismantled if it's harming our communities and not allowing for true housing choice and access and opportunity to exist? So I think that if we paid more attention to the choices that people have and these system level issues, we could start to see everything that many of us already know, which is that there are certain groups of people in the society that have an abundance of choices and opportunity, and other people who have very limited choices and opportunities. And then if we try to further understand that, we can directly tie that back to the history and to these policies that have created these very intricate and intentional systems that make it almost impossible, no matter how hard you work, almost impossible to really get out of the impact of these systems. As a young person, I was told, as a black woman in America, I'm gonna have to work twice as hard for maybe even half the benefits, and that's very much true, because we do not pay attention to systems enough and talk about how to change and how to abolish ones that do not work for us as a community.
Thank you. Councilman Arthur, what policies do you see today that are negatively impacting residents?
Well, sometimes it's about a lack of a policy. And I'll give you two examples, one of which we've changed and one we're in the process of changing. And that lack of a policy, I'll use the Affordable Housing Trust Fund as an example. Created in 2008. I was a junior in high school. Since then, we have been funding affordable housing in the city of Louisville. But when you look at the ordinance very clearly states that half of this money has to be used for families at 50% area median income, and the rest of it has to be used for up to 80. And if you have any private donations or any other sources such as grants, you can use it for any level of income. The issue with that is when you unpack the needs in terms of housing in the city of Louisville, the greatest need is for families that are at 30% area median income, AKA a family of four making about $25,000 a year, or one person making about $16,000 a year, who's typically going to be someone who is 65 and older, or maybe they are disabled and unable to obtain employment. So the issue with that ordinance and the lack of policy was that you're funding homes for people largely that aren't of the need or of as great of a need, and then you put out homes into the market that people can afford. You know, the neighborhood that I live in, over half of those families are towards that 30% area median income. So that means the houses that are getting built from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, my neighbors might not be able to afford. The people across the street from me won't be able to afford. So it took some arguing and it took busting some heads, but we were able to get an earmarking specifically for families at 30% area median income, families at the lowest level of income, from that Affordable Housing Trust Fund for the first time ever since 2008 when it was created. And on the flip side, something that is not in place in terms of policy that we're working on is an ordinance that some of you may have heard of called the Historically Black Neighborhoods Ordinance. And the ordinance essentially takes any neighborhood in this city that was settled by freedmen, settled by my ancestors, by some of the ancestors you've heard from today. It labels them as a historically black neighborhood. And any development that takes place in that neighborhood that utilizes Louisville Metro government resources, our money, our property, our land, we analyze it, and we decide whether or not the people in proximity of that development can afford it. If they cannot, then Louisville Metro government will not, once we pass it, they will not help you build it. As of now, there is no policy. So we could open up a grocery store right in the middle of the Russell community, and none of the residents can afford to shop in there, and there's nothing stopping Louisville Metro government from contributing to that grocery store being built. Whether that's a grocery store, an apartment complex, a house, it doesn't matter. There's no policy right now that is stopping us from contributing to displacement, which really contributes to interpersonal violence, because as we've pointed out, if you don't have a home and a safe space to live, that's the foundation of your being. If you are displaced from your residence, if you are gentrified out of your community, you really only got a few options. You might end up somewhere under the expressway in a tent, in a junkyard, houseless. You might end up in desperation committing a crime in a prison yard, or worst case scenario, you'll end up in a graveyard. That is why housing is essential. This is the centerpiece of your well-being. And sometimes these policies are also exacerbated by the lack of policy that is in place to protect people at the very bottom, which is who I prioritize.
Thank you, Jacory. So any other panelists, please feel free to comment on where the crisis today is in Louisville with housing. And that could be affordable housing, evictions, homelessness.
Okay, I think that, and going back to what John said and what you said about systems, that we have to understand the systems. Okay, I feel like the systems wasn't created for the black men to get ahead. So I'm looking at the different systems and I'm saying, if people understand the systems, they understand the systems. But they're not going to change the system because they are profited by it. So why give up their privilege to make someone else comfortable? So as long as we have that mentality about we're not going to give up the privilege, then we're going to continue to do like we do. When you talk about everybody needs a safe, stable living environment, in a stable living environment, it does not mean couch surfing. It does not mean that you are in an apartment that is rat infested, the plumbing doesn't work. That's not a safe environment. And we wonder, as you said about the prison pipeline for prison, school to prison, okay, we wonder why our children are not doing well in school. How can our children go to school and study and get their lessons when they're not living in a safe environment? They're not living in a stable environment. We continue to say that our children need a stable living environment. We continue to say they have a choice out here, but what choice is there when that mother or that father is trying to raise their children and they're working 2 jobs to pay the rent? And we have one thing we haven't talked about. We keep talking about affordable housing, but we need to look at raising the minimum wage so people can make a decent wage so they can take care of not only their basic needs, but they can have extra to take care of their children. So when we look at systems, we have to look at it all the way, not only the housing, we have to look at the education, we have to look at the wage and where people are able to live.
And I'd like to add too that as far as the question about where does the crisis exist, I think it exists everywhere. I think anybody in this space who hasn't ever been to eviction court, which is very accessible now because it is online, I challenge everyone to find the Zoom information for eviction court and experience what that is like. It is the most dehumanizing experience that I can ever even communicate to you all. It is the epitome of profit over people, because eviction court is designed in the landlord's favor every single time. That is reflected in our uniform residential landlord-tenant tenant laws that exist in Jefferson County. In the rest of most of Kentucky, a landlord can come to your house at any moment and evict you. The only benefit that we have by having your URLTA is that they have to give you a 7-day or a 14-day notice before they evict you. And that law also provides no remedies for tenants to advocate for themselves and to ensure that their landlords are offering proper and safe housing. The only thing that that law does is say that if a tenant is not happy with the circumstances, they can leave. That is the only option and protection that tenants are given in our state as far as how they can remedy housing situations. And then when we look at the houselessness issue, we have programs through HUD that exist, like the Common Assessment Program. It's supposed to be an assessment that people who are houseless can take to help them get housing vouchers and access to affordable housing. But in order to qualify for that program, you have to be actively living in the streets or living in your car. I've had clients that were couch surfing, were doubling up with people, even in the middle of a pandemic, and still now, the definition or the criteria for houselessness to tap into these resources require people to be at the end of their rope. We are extremely reactive when it comes to dealing with housing stability issues, and the policies that are in place reinforce that and give us no options to really support people who are low income or do not have stable housing. So I think it exists everywhere.
And just to add to like how sick the housing crisis really is, she was talking about eviction court. When people are evicted and they end up in whatever predicament they end up on the other side, whether it's couch surfing, being overcrowded in somebody else's home, living in a shelter, living on the streets, when someone is evicted, that opens up housing for someone else who's in one of those circumstances to move in. And a lot of people don't realize this, but when you drive around Louisville, anywhere and everywhere, because houselessness is affecting the entire city, the people on the streets, they're on the streets because there's nowhere for them to go. There is no housing. We are missing 31,412 units of housing for families at the lowest level of income. And in 2019, that was a $3.5 trillion bill to take care of. Over the course of time, because construction costs have gone up, labor, lumber, now that's over $5 billion, would it be? $5 billion worth of housing that needs to get built. Just to contextualize that a little bit, the entire city budget that we just passed, from all the salaries, everybody's salary, to the services that get provided, to the materials we have to buy, to the rent and whatever we pay for our expenses and our overhead, and the whole city budget was $1 billion. And just to fix housing alone for families at the very bottom is $5 billion. We need help from the state and we need help from the feds, and I'm grateful for the American Rescue Plan, but if you contextualize that, 380 something million with that $5 billion ticket, that's chump change. It really is. And it's unfortunate, just to bring it back to eviction court, that when I'm in a meeting talking about getting people housed, because we don't have the inventory that we need, and we ask questions about rehousing, and we say to the director of housing, who does incredible work, how are you going to house people when there is no housing? The only answer she can give is that we have to wait on somebody to get evicted. It's a very vicious cycle. Please don't clap after I talk, because this ain't nothing to be proud of.
Thank you. Now, we do just have a few more minutes. I do want to get final thoughts from each of the panelists. Also, keep in mind the question of where people can turn for help or where we go from here. So give us just a few thoughts around that, and we'll start with John.
Well, to belabor the point that I made earlier, educate yourself. I'm embarrassed at how little I knew about race. I'm embarrassed at how much I still don't know. But the more that I read, the more that I understand, the more that I understand, the more that I'm compelled to act. So definitely some of my favorite I mean, again, favorite is probably a poor term. Some of the most informative books have been The Color of Law, have been The New Jim Crow, How to Be an Anti-Racist. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson is a book that broke my heart open in ways that I didn't understand it could. I do not travel to Chicago. I do not travel to Los Angeles, to San Francisco, to Oakland, to Detroit, to St. Louis, to New York without carrying the stories of the people in that book with me. That's the kind of impact that education can have on you. The other thing that, you know, I'm convinced that change occurs because of relationships. If you look at the progress that we've made with LGBTQ plus issues over the last 10 years, why did that happen? Because there were enough people who came out to their families and their friends, and then all of a sudden everybody knew somebody who was gay, lesbian, trans, and then those relationships transformed ideologies. That's how we change racism, and again, my limited understanding, that's how we change racism in the white community, is by changing the dynamics of the relationships. We have a very segregated society, and we have to do something about that. So on an individual level, that could mean getting involved with a Black-led organization like the Louisville Urban League. It could be joining a Black church. It could be getting outside of the circles that you're normally in, outside of your comfort zone, and allowing relationships to change our hearts.
Thank you. Jackie?
Okay, I've got to give a shout out to the place where I work at, Russell Place of Promise. We are a project incubated by Cities United and Metro government. But we are focused on building Black wealth in, let me take this off, I'm sorry. Ooh. We are focused on building Black wealth in the Russell community. We partner with the residents, and they tell us how they want to build Black wealth for themselves, their families, and the community. So in partner, we listen to them, and we make sure that we connect them to the resources and the opportunities that are available to them. And we, as I say, it's a partnership in working with the residents. And we talk about how, if they want to buy a house, okay, we take them to the resources. One of the things that I was talking to a coworker today, she was telling me about the Home Buyers Club that they are developing. And what they do, they will assist the residents that want to buy a house, the Russell residents that want to buy a house, they will assist them, they will work with them until they buy that house. Russell Place of Promise, like I said, we involve the community. Not only do we look at building wealth through home ownership, we look at small businesses. If you want to own your business, if you want to retain your business, we will work with you that way. We also look at if you want a higher paying job so that you can buy a home for your family. We work with the residents that. So what I'm saying is that we need more programs like Russell Place of Promise, not only in Russell, but in the other parts of the city, because everyone deserves a home in our city.
Thank you, Jackie. Celine?
I think my takeaway would be, especially for young people like me, to get engaged and get involved. We have a lot more power than I think that we recognize. And that means getting engaged at all levels, you know, whether it's engagement with, you know, our mayor, our legislators, but when we're thinking about housing and eviction court, I'm really passionate about housing stability. We cannot continue to live in a world where property matters more than people. And I'd like to remind my generation, everyone that's in this room, that judges are elected officials as well. You know, we put them in those positions, and we have the power to say that people should not just be thrown out on the street because they missed one payment of rent, because they had to miss work because they were sick with COVID. We cannot continue to treat housing like it's just a market thing and not a thing that people need for foundation, for safety, for stability, for growth and opportunity. So I think that there's a lot we can do, and there's things being done all over the country to reform eviction court to ensure that landlords aren't able to discriminate when they file for evictions, even when they're offered rent assistance, and yet continue to choose to move forward with displacing somebody in the middle of a pandemic. That is not okay, that is not acceptable. And there's way too much of a power difference between landlords and tenants, and there's way more that we can do in the court process to ensure that people have the support they need to fight for housing stability, especially when we're missing as many units as Councilman Arthur just told us about. Thank you.
So, y'all know I'm a professor at our local HBCU, so I'm gonna give y'all some homework. But before I give you that homework, let me really set that up. You know, we're talking about the housing crisis, and you know who it impacts more than anybody else. The 2019 Housing Needs Assessment identified that about 78% of the unsheltered population was Black. That's almost 8 in 10 people that are living outside. Over half of the JCPS students who are unhoused are Black. And they're what, a third of the student population? This overwhelmingly impacts us. So as you think about all last year where everybody was saying Black Lives Matter and y'all were talking that talk, now it's time to walk that walk. So here's the homework. Hopefully I got phones that they got the internet on, take them out. Come on, so we can go home. This is the homework. If you go to Lou, homeless.org, louhomeless.org. You can go to their website and there's a link you can click, or you can go louhomeless.org/ARP to go directly to the page that we're looking for. louhomeless.org/ARP. There is a form. You put your name in, you put your address in, it will automatically tell you who your council person is, and it will automatically populate a letter to send to your council person that breaks down what we need to spend on housing from the American Rescue Plan, and the council is making those decisions right now. In January, when they went outside and counted how many people were in shelters and in encampments, there were 833 families. Cold night of the year. 833 families were not in permanent sustainable housing. To house those 833 families, that letter tells your council person exactly what we need to spend, and we actually have that money now. We just have to make the decision to spend it. There's only 26 council members. There's over 26,000 of you in each of those districts. So the more that you advocate and the more that you connect with your neighbors and your residents and you build power with them, because the more people, the more power, the more change that will come as a result of your advocacy. And thank you all for being here, because that's important. Showing up is half of it sometimes.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Do we have any final thoughts from our storytellers?
We must come together as a community and not think just it takes just one person to do the job. This job is massive, and it calls for each and every last one of us. And it calls for us to not separate ourselves by East End, West End, South End, and North End of the cities. It tells us that we must come together and not be divided by streets, such as streets with double names, such as River Park, and then when you get to 30th Street, it becomes Chestnut. And we all know that that is why whites at that time, my era, did not want to live on the same street that had the same name that black people lived on. That's why we have divisions, still have divisions of streets, and we must always remember that racism is very much alive, and we will never kill racism, but if we make a big effort to start chopping the head of that racist snake, then we will move from first base to second base, and remember that freedom and justice is a constant struggle. It never ends.
Ooh, Lord. What I would like to say is, as John said it all, we are racist due to lack of education. If you pick up the book, The Color of Law, you will understand that your government, the United States of America, the land of the free in the home of the brave created the segregated and racist systems that are in place. I don't know how my grandmother did it. She bought a house in Portland in 1922. She paid $18 a month for the mortgage. And I wish I could have asked her how she did that. And as John mentioned, there were covenants on properties that did not allow white people to sell land to people of color. If you look at your history, the Jewish people lived in old Louisville because of those covenants. Okay, so you have to really start educating yourself. You can't believe all this rhetoric that your buddy tells you. You know, I mean, you just can't believe it. And so you have to educate yourself so that you know what you're talking about. And white silence is approval. Is approval. Not long ago, 2 years ago, I went to a reunion of some friends, so-called friends that I used to work with. When I got there, I was met by an LGBT guy and told me they didn't allow black people. Now I looked at him, but nobody said anything about it. Not a soul, not a soul. And the man whose house I was coming to, he finally found out about it and came out because I was starting to walk away, but I said, no, I ain't gonna do this. I'm here. I even made a special trip to go find out where it was, so because it was gonna be dark when I got there, and I didn't, you know, I was in one of them areas that I just wanted to make sure that I know where I'm going, don't get lost, so I don't have no issues. So if you see racism, any kind of form of discrimination, and you sit there and be silent, then you co-sign it. You're just as guilty as the person who did it. So we have to step up. We have to step up, speak up, because if it's not going away, it's going to keep going from one generation to the next. So you have to say is you know, I'm going to have a great-grandchild born next month. What's that life going to be like? What's it going to be like? So, you know, the ball's in your court. You have to learn to play it. Are you going to be in the game? Or are you going to be on the bench?
Thank you so much again to our storytellers and to our panelists. We thank you all for being with us tonight. This is the first of 4 conversations. The other topics to come will be on education, policing, and health. The next conversation will be held at the Muhammad Ali Center on October 28th at 7 p.m., and that one will be on education. It also will be streamed live by the Courier Journal and shared on their social media sites, also the social media of partner organizations, the Frazier History Museum and the Ali Center. And with that, I will give it back over to Rachel, and we will wrap up.
And thank you to Trent Finley tonight for being our moderator with Metro United Way. Again, I think the bottom line is educate yourselves, don't sit silently. And as Ja'Cory said at that news conference most recently, what are you doing? What are you doing to advocate and create and be that catalyst for change? We thank you all for coming. We hope you'll come to the other conversations. I hope I've written a lot of books that I need to read. So thank you for my homework assignment on that. And again, thank you all for coming, caring enough to come, and I hope you take the action to the streets. And thank you all very much.